In court, my parents said I was a failure. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct them. I sat quietly in the back row of my sister's trial, hands folded, eyes forward, while my parents spoke with practiced certainty about how I'd never lived up to expectations. "She's always been too quiet," my mother said. "Smart, maybe, but not successful," my father added. They said it like a diagnosis. Final, public. The courtroom hummed with whispers as the judge paused the proceedings. Jurisdictional confusion, federal complications, a brief, hushed exchange behind the bench. Then the judge turned toward me. "Miss Harris," he said evenly, "would you please take the bench?" The room went dead silent. My parents turned around, and in that moment, standing up, walking forward, I realized something sharper than revenge, heavier than vindication. They hadn't failed to believe in me. They had failed to know me at all. I learned early that our house had rules no one ever bothered to explain out loud. They weren't written down, but they were enforced all the same. My sister Emily was the center of gravity. Everything in our family seemed to orbit around her, her opinions, her achievements, her future. When she walked into a room, conversations shifted to make space for her. When she spoke, people listened. I was the other daughter, the quieter one, the one who didn't interrupt, didn't demand attention, didn't need much, at least that's how it looked from the outside. Adults loved to describe me as low maintenance, as if that were a compliment. What it really meant was that my needs were easy to ignore. At dinner, my father would lean back in his chair and ask Emily about her day in detail. "How did the presentation go? Did your professor say anything about that internship? What's next for you?" Those questions came rapid fire, full of interest and expectation. When his gaze finally drifted to me, it was softer, distracted, already halfway elsewhere. "And you?" he'd ask. "Everything okay?" I learned to answer in one word. Fine. It kept the peace. My mother wasn't cruel. That's what made it harder to name what she did. She was warm, polite, endlessly busy. She showed love in practical ways, laundry folded, meals cooked, reminders given. But admiration? Pride? Those were reserved for Emily. When relatives visited, my mother would beam as she recounted Emily's accomplishments, stacking them one on top of another, like proof that she had done something right as a parent. "And this is our younger daughter," she'd say, gesturing vaguely in my direction. "She's very sweet." Sweet. Not driven, not brilliant, just sweet. I remember one afternoon in 8th grade, standing in the kitchen with a certificate clutched in my hands. I had won a regional academic competition, something I'd worked weeks for, staying up late to prepare. I set the certificate carefully on the counter, smoothing out the edges, waiting for someone to notice. My mother glanced at it while scrolling through her phone. "That's nice, honey," she said without looking up. A few minutes later, she slid it aside to make room for a stack of brochures Emily had brought home from college tours. The certificate disappeared under glossy pamphlets and smiling campus photos. No one mentioned it again. That was the moment something in me shifted. Not anger, something quieter. Understanding. I realized that in our family, achievement only mattered if it was loud enough to impress other people. Emily's successes were easy to celebrate because they were visible, social, shareable. Mine were solitary, private, inconvenient. I stopped bringing things home to show them. I stopped explaining what I was interested in, because every explanation ended the same way, with a joke, a dismissal, or a gentle redirection back to Emily. Once I tried talking about a book I was reading, something about constitutional law. My father laughed. "Careful," he said, smiling. "You're starting to sound like a lawyer." Emily laughed too. "God," she said, rolling her eyes. "Can you even hear yourself?" Everyone laughed. I didn't. I just went quiet. Silence became my safest place. In silence, I could think. I could watch. I could learn who people really were when they thought I wasn't important enough to impress. I didn't know it then, but those years of being overlooked were teaching me discipline, patience, and focus, the kind that doesn't ask for permission or applause. To my parents, I was the daughter who hadn't failed exactly but hadn't succeeded in a way that mattered. And for a long time, I believed them. By the time I left for college, I understood something my parents never did. Distance can be a form of survival. I didn't frame it as rebellion or independence. I simply stopped offering myself up for judgment. I applied to schools quietly, filled out financial aid forms alone, and packed my life into 2 suitcases without ceremony. My parents hugged me at the door, proud in the abstract way you are when nothing about a situation forces you to look closely. They assumed I would study something practical. Safe. You'll figure it out, my mother said, the way people do when they don't expect much more. I didn't correct her when I chose pre-law. I didn't tell them about the honors seminars or the late nights in the library, surrounded by casebooks and yellow legal pads filled edge to edge with notes. I learned early that announcing my goals only invited comparison, and comparison was a game I was never meant to win. Law school came later, quietly, the same way everything meaningful in my life always did. I earned my place there without fanfare, without family dinners or celebratory phone calls. When I received my acceptance letter, I read it twice, folded it neatly, and tucked it into a drawer. There was no one to celebrate with, but there was also no one to diminish it. That felt like freedom. I worked harder than anyone knew. While others networked loudly, I stayed late, volunteering for the unglamorous research no one wanted. I learned how systems worked from the inside, how power moved, how laws were written, bent, and enforced. Professors remembered me not because I spoke the most, but because when I did speak, it mattered. Back home, none of this registered. To my parents, I was still the quiet one. The updates they shared with relatives were vague and unimpressive by design. She helps lawyers, my mother once said at a family gathering. Sort of like an assistant, my father added helpfully. I heard about it later, secondhand, and chose not to correct them. Titles meant nothing to people who had already decided who you were. When I finally began working in the federal system, the nature of my role required discretion. No photos, no announcements, no social media posts. It suited me. My family still thought I filed paperwork and reviewed documents for other people's arguments. In a way, they weren't entirely wrong. I just happened to be shaping the outcomes instead. Sometimes, late at night, I wondered what would happen if they really asked about my life. But they never did. And over time, I stopped waiting for them to. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, sharp and unexpected, like a sound you don't realize you've been bracing for your whole life. It was my mother. She didn't ask how I was. She never did. "Emily's having some trouble," she said, lowering her voice as if the word itself might be contagious. Trouble, it turned out, meant a lawsuit. A financial dispute tied to the company Emily had built, the one my parents loved to brag about at dinner parties. The one that made them sit a little straighter when they said her name. According to my mother, it was all nonsense. A misunderstanding. Bitter people trying to take advantage of success. "She's done nothing wrong," she insisted. "You know how people are when they're jealous." I listened without interrupting. I always did. The trial was scheduled weeks later in a downtown courthouse. I wasn't invited, not officially, but my mother mentioned it in passing. The way you mention the weather or a dentist appointment. "You don't have to come," she said quickly. "It's probably not your kind of thing. And the rescission. It is not ran of did." I went anyway. I took a seat in the back of the courtroom, far from the polished confidence surrounding Emily. She sat at the defense table in a tailored suit, her posture perfect, her expression calm in the way people look when they still believe the world will bend for them. My parents sat behind her, whispering reassurances, nodding along to every word her attorneys said. They didn't look back once. During a recess, I overheard my father speaking to a reporter. "Our older daughter is brilliant," he said proudly. "A real success story." Then, almost as an afterthought, "Our younger one? She's different. Not really built for pressure." I stared at the courtroom floor as he said it, my face warm, my jaw tight. Failure, once again, assigned to me without question. What none of them knew, what they never thought to ask, was that I hadn't come to watch out of curiosity or loyalty. I was there because I had been asked to observe. Quietly, professionally. Because the case was already showing signs of crossing a line it shouldn't. I sat there, listening to the arguments, watching the cracks form beneath Emily's carefully rehearsed confidence. And as the trial moved forward, I felt something settle deep in my chest, not fear, not anger, but certainty. Whatever happened next, this story was no longer just about my sister. The moment came quietly. the way most humiliations do. Not with shouting, not with drama, just a few careless words spoken with absolute certainty. Emily's attorney was explaining the defense's position, framing the case as a series of unfortunate misunderstandings. My parents nodded along, their confidence unshaken. When the prosecutor paused and asked for character context, my mother leaned forward without hesitation, as if she'd been waiting for the chance. "Our family values hard work," she said clearly, her voice carrying farther than she realized. "Emily has always embodied that." She smiled, proud. Then she added, almost casually, "Our younger daughter never really found her footing. She struggled. Some people just aren't built for pressure." My father nodded in agreement. "She never aimed very high," he said. "Nice girl, but not exactly a success story." There it was, said out loud. In public, in court. I felt every eye in the room slide toward me, not with curiosity, but with assumption. The way people look at someone once a label has been applied. Failure, disappointment, the one who didn't make it. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I kept my hands folded in my lap and my expression neutral, even as something tight and familiar wrapped itself around my chest. Not pain exactly, recognition. This was who they had always believed me to be. This was the version of me they carried into every room. The judge glanced briefly in my direction, then back to the proceedings. No reaction, no comment. The court moved on, as if my parents hadn't just summarized my entire existence in 2 dismissive sentences. Emily didn't look back at me. She didn't need to. Their words worked in her favor. They always had. Inside, I felt the old instinct rise, the urge to shrink, to disappear, to let the moment pass without resistance. Years of practice had taught me how to do that well. Silence had been my armor, my refuge, my discipline. But something was different this time. As the arguments continued, I listened more closely, no longer as a sister, but as a professional. I heard the inconsistencies my parents ignored, the gaps Emily's attorneys danced around, the subtle shift in the judge's tone as questions became sharper, more precise. Jurisdiction was being tested. Lines were being crossed. The case was slipping out of the neat story my family wanted to tell. When the judge finally called for a recess, the room exhaled. Chairs scraped. Voices rose. My parents leaned toward Emily, murmuring reassurance. "It's going fine," my mother whispered. "This will blow over." I stayed where I was, still, watching, because for the first time in my life, being underestimated wasn't a weakness, it was an advantage. And while my parents were busy explaining why I was a failure, the court was quietly realizing something else entirely. This trial was about to change direction. The shift didn't happen all at once. It began with a question, one precise, carefully placed question that landed heavier than any accusation. The prosecutor introduced a document tied to transactions that crossed state lines. Then another, and another. The language changed. The tone sharpened. Words like federal threshold and interstate jurisdiction floated into the air, unmistakable and irreversible. The judge leaned back, eyes narrowing. He asked the attorneys to approach the bench. Their voices dropped, urgent and controlled. Papers exchanged hands. A pause stretched longer than it should have. "Recess," the judge said finally. The courtroom buzzed. My parents exhaled with relief. My mother squeezed Emily's arm. "See?" she whispered. "They're just sorting out details." I stayed seated. I had heard this music before. I knew exactly where it led. When the court reconvened, the judge's expression was different. No warmth, no patience. He spoke slowly, deliberately, as if choosing words that could not be taken back. "This matter may exceed the current court's jurisdiction," he said. "Federal implications have been identified." A murmur rippled through the room. Emily's attorney stiffened. My father frowned, confused. The judge adjusted his glasses. Then he looked past the attorneys, past the reporters, past my parents. He looked directly at me. "Miss Harris," he said evenly, "would you please come forward and take the bench?" For half a second, no one moved. No one breathed. I stood. The sound of my heels against the courtroom floor echoed with a clarity that made heads turn. I walked past the defense table, past Emily, who stared at me as if seeing a stranger, and stopped at the steps of the bench. My mother's face drained of color. "What is this?" she whispered. The bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise." The entire courtroom stood as I took my place. The judge stepped aside, nodding once, respectful. "Judge Harris will now preside," he said. I looked out over the room, over my parents frozen in their seats, over my sister's unraveling composure, and felt something settle inside me. Not triumph, not anger, clarity. "This court will proceed under federal jurisdiction," I said calmly. "All prior motions will be reviewed." My parents had spent years explaining why I was a failure. Now, without raising my voice, without saying their names, I was explaining the law, and for the first time, they were finally forced to listen. I didn't look at my parents when I sat down. I didn't look at Emily either. The moment I took the bench, the room stopped being a family space and became what it was always meant to be, a courtroom. Personal history had no standing here. Only facts did. The prosecution resumed with renewed precision. Evidence that had once seemed circumstantial now fell neatly into place under federal review. Transactions mapped across state lines. Communications timed too perfectly to be accidental. Patterns that told a story no amount of confidence could rewrite. Emily's attorney objected once, twice, too late. "Overruled," I said, my voice steady, neutral. Each ruling felt clean, controlled, necessary. I wasn't proving anything to anyone. I wasn't correcting the past. I was doing the job I had trained for, the job I had earned in rooms far quieter than this one. During a brief recess, Emily approached me in the hallway, her composure cracking for the first time. "You're really going to do this?" she whispered. To me, I met her gaze without flinching. "I'm not doing anything to you," I said. "I'm doing my job." My mother tried next. Her voice shook, thin and urgent. "You don't understand what this will do to our family," she said. I finally looked at her then. "I understand perfectly," I replied. "I always have." When the court resumed, I returned to the bench without another word. The jury listened. The record grew heavier. By the time closing arguments ended, the outcome was no longer a question of loyalty or belief. It was a matter of law. When the verdict was read guilty, the word landed like a held breath finally released. My parents sat motionless. Emily stared straight ahead, stunned, as if the world had betrayed her rather than the other way around. I read the sentence clearly, without emphasis, without satisfaction. "Court is adjourned." The gavel fell once. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't vindication. It was accountability, something my family had never offered me, and something the law demanded now. When the courtroom finally emptied, the noise didn't follow me. Reporters crowded the hallway, voices overlapping, cameras flashing, but I took a side exit and walked away without answering a single question. I didn't need to explain myself to strangers. I had spent enough of my life being explained by my family. I sat alone in my chambers, the door closed, the air still. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel the weight of it all, not triumph, not relief, just the quiet aftermath of something that could never be undone. The past hadn't been corrected. It had simply been acknowledged. My phone vibrated on the desk. A voicemail. My mother. "We didn't know," she said, her voice breaking. "If we had known who you really were," I stopped listening. Knowing now didn't change what they had chosen then. Recognition that arrives only after power reveals itself isn't love. It's fear dressed as regret. Later that evening, my father tried too. An email, careful words, apologies framed like explanations. I deleted it without replying. Not out of anger, but out of clarity. Some conversations don't heal, they reopen wounds that finally closed. I met my friend Rachel for dinner at a quiet place across town. No one there recognized me. No one whispered. She raised her glass the moment I sat down. "You did exactly what you were supposed to do," she said. I nodded. "For the first time," I replied. I didn't need anyone's approval. On my drive home, I thought about how long I had waited for my parents to see me. How many versions of myself I had minimized just to stay tolerable. And I realized something that felt both heavy and freeing. I didn't owe them reconciliation. Silence, once used against me, had become my boundary, and this time, I chose it. The weeks after the trial passed quietly. The headlines came and went, as they always do, chasing the next scandal, the next public collapse. I didn't read them. I didn't need to. The most important verdict had already been reached, one I had delivered to myself. I went back to my work with a different kind of focus. Lighter, steadier. The weight I'd carried for years, the need to be seen by people who refused to look, was gone. In its place was something far more useful: clarity. I started mentoring again, something I'd once done cautiously, afraid of taking up too much space. Now I welcomed the quiet knock on my door. Young women came in with nervous smiles and folded notes, their voices soft with doubt. "They say I'm too quiet," one of them admitted. I smiled, recognizing myself. "Let them talk," I said. Precision doesn't need volume. Over time, I watched them stand taller, speak cleaner, claim rooms without asking for permission. And each time I was reminded that power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits patient, disciplined until the moment it's needed. My parents never tried again. The distance remained, firm and necessary. I didn't fill it. Some fractures protect what finally becomes whole. On a Friday evening, long after the courthouse emptied, I walked through the silent hallway one last time before heading home. My reflection caught in the glass, calm, unafraid, unmistakably present. They once called me a failure because I didn't fit the story they wanted to tell. But success was never about fitting in. It was about knowing your worth and choosing yourself, even when no one else ever did.